Welcome back to this Great Academy lecture in Junior Cycle History, and today we will be talking about the Reformation. The Reformation is one of the most important events, pan-European events of the last millennium, for the reasons we will discuss later on in this lesson. Now, the learning objectives in the history of Europe and the wider world state that students should be able to consider the historical importance of religion with particular reference to the Reformation and the actions of one reformer. So what I say right here is that it's important that you prepare one reformer, but you should also be aware of subsequent reformers. Obviously, I'm going to go with Martin Luther as he is the original and the most consequential reformer in this period. But I will also be mentioning those he inspired after him. So what the possible questions are? Number one, it's very important to be able to name and describe the abuses or the corruption within the Christian church circa 1500, around the 1500s. And the reason for that is that really brings to the fore what inspired Luther or drove Luther to publicly condemn the church and its abuses and corruption. So you need to be able to identify and explain them. Identify and explain commonly held beliefs about the church at this time. We're going to be touching on them as well. Examining a primary source like the 95 Theses. That is something that you should be doing. Most likely will come up in a short form in the exam if the Reformation comes up in your particular junior cert year. And by that I mean they might choose 5 or 6 of the 95 Theses. They give you an extract from it and you have to answer questions on it. Examine how religion affected regional, national, and cultural identity. Examine the life of a reformer, so very important, and how his work affected religious and political landscape of Europe. Identify the long-term effects of the Reformation on Europe, leading on from that, and identify technological change that contributed to the spread of new religious beliefs. Obviously, what we're talking about here is Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. So let's look at the common abuses. Simony, that was the sale of church positions. In other words, if you came from a wealthy family, you could buy a position within the church as a priest or a deacon or a bishop even, if you had enough money. And skip largely the whole selection process and study for it. So that was a very, very significant corruption because it led to very unqualified people or lazy or spoiled, you could say, simply getting high-paying positions within the church automatically. Nepotism then, and the way to remember nepotism is, remember neph is the first 3 letters of nephew, a relation, a family relative. So that's the election or hiring of family relatives to church positions. So that would require a priest, a bishop, or cardinal, or whatever, electing one of their own relatives to a church position. Absenteeism, obviously being regularly absent from a church position, often connected to the next one. Pluralism, the practice of occupying more than one position in the church at one time. So if you had 2 positions, it was quite corrupt, but it also meant that you would absolutely necessarily you'd have to be absent from one or the other for a large portion of the time if you're occupying 2 positions. And then the really ideologically corrupt idea, the selling of indulgences in exchange for money. Indulgences were special prayers meant to guarantee one's salvation, and they were really the spark that drove Martin Luther as he observed and witnessed John Tetzel, a monk, a friar, in his area of what would be modern-day Germany, selling indulgences. And Luther was appalled by this and outraged, the idea that you could pay money and that in some way the church could say a prayer for you and would guarantee your place in heaven. It went against everything in the scriptures, obviously. Now, the question you might ask is, why did people, willingly go along with these corrupt practices, particularly that one, the sale of indulgences, if it was against church doctrine or Christian doctrine? Well, the simple answer to that is that all church services and prayers, all the different incantations and recitals were in Latin, and only the very educated spoke and read Latin. So most of the peasantry of Europe was entirely ignorant of what was being said, but more so what the actual Bible said. They were ignorant of it because they didn't speak Latin. So before we go on, a very important keyword: heretic. Someone who publicly opposes church doctrine. Basically, they're condemned as a heretic, which is someone who is blasphemous and almost close to evil. And that's what Martin Luther was accused of: heresy. So let's have a look here. So there are three stages in this, really. The pioneer is Martin Luther. The second generation then is the John Calvin and John Knox, for example, in Calvinism and Presbyterianism. And then we have the church's response to these reform movements. So it's important to have at least one of these reformers know their life's work. The background to Martin Luther was that he originally studied as a lawyer. And that's an important point, because if you're not aware of what the legal system is, the legal system interprets the meaning of written regulations. And therefore, anyone who studies law tends to have a very sharp understanding of what a written regulation was intended to mean or what it could mean. And his background study in law contributes hugely to his ability not only to understand scripture, but to argue a different interpretation of it, or in his case, a more rigid and universal interpretation of it. So he became, after he was caught in a storm, he made a promise to God that if he survived, he would actually spend the rest of his life in the service of God. So by 1512, he had switched over and become professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Now, that will be important later. He studied the Bible extensively between 1512 and 1517, and he came up with his own theory: justification by faith alone. You see, the church believed up to this point in a policy of faith and good works. The idea that you had to have faith in God in order to be saved or find salvation in heaven once you die, but you also had to do good works. Now, that goes back to, that's a pretty generally good idea, that you had to be kind to the poor and be charitable and be forgiving. The problem with good works is that it was so vague that eventually it was interpreted in a very corrupt manner. And of course, the good works here included sale of indulgences. The church was able to argue that by buying indulgences, the church would guarantee your place in heaven, but it would also contribute to the building of new churches and maybe provisions for helping the very poor or the hungry. So good works is a very broad and vague idea. And of course, this ultimately became very corrupted. For example, Tetzel was collecting indulgences in that part of modern-day Germany in an effort to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Not exactly, for the poor and hungry and destitute, more for an elaborate kind of vanity project, you could call it almost. And certainly that's the way Martin Luther viewed it. So he came up with an opposing ideology: justification by faith alone. And the key word here being alone. Only faith can get you into heaven. And his idea developed over the next few years that every single Christian should study the Bible themselves, should read the Bible themselves, and see what it has to say, and then live their lives accordingly. Good works, they're good, but they're not necessary for salvation. So in 1517, Luther nailed, or as the legend goes, he nailed the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. Now, there's actually no recorded proof that he nailed it, but for whatever on the church door, but wherever he put it, it created a public scandal and outcry, and it reached all the way to Rome. Now, what were the 95 Theses? The 95 Theses were a collection of complaints and criticisms by Luther of the church's behaviour, the corruption in the church, and so on and so forth. In response to this, the Pope sent him a papal bull. Now, a papal bull is essentially a diktat from the Pope. Exsurge Domine, recant in the name of God. A very, very strong-worded, the most strongly worded communication you could get from the Pope, that you have done something very heretical. You've committed heresy. So this papal bull called on him to recant or take back what he said in 95 Theses, and to do so publicly. In response to the Pope burning his 95 Theses, Luther then turned up the heat even more by publicly burning the papal bull in Wittenberg. In 1521, in an effort to sort this all out, or to quieten down this whole controversy around Martin Luther's arguments and beliefs, he was invited to the Diet of Worms. Now, the Diet of Worms was held in Worms in modern-day Germany, which was in the Holy Roman Empire, which was ruled by Charles V. Now, Charles V was ostensibly, or on the surface, seemed to be the emperor of this very large kind of new, smaller conglomerate of small kingdoms called the Holy Roman Empire. But in reality, he needed the backing of the Pope in order to maintain his legitimacy, and he also needed the backing of all the other princes of all the other states within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain his position as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So Charles V decided to calm things down and keep the church on his side. He would call Martin Luther to this Diet of Worms, where he was publicly challenged to recant, to take back his criticisms and what he stated in the 95 Theses. Of course, Martin Luther, very intimidated, but refused to take it back. So over the next couple of years, Luther is then condemned a heretic and makes his way home from Worms. But on the way, Frederick the Wise, his patron, the owner and builder of the University of Wittenberg, I'm just going to write that up there, who actually kidnaps him and hides him in a castle to protect him, because as a heretic, you could be killed by anyone, and there would be no consequences to it. So heretics had no protection under the law, and the owner of the university, Frederick the Wise, decided to kidnap him and hide him away until things calmed down a lot. And while he hid him away in the Wartburg castle, Luther translated the Bible into German. Now, why is that important? Well, for the first time ever, Germans who have basic literacy, who speak German, will be able to understand scripture as it is written, in the original form. So this is an important moment. It kind of liberalizes the Bible for many German-speaking people, and of course it will be translated in all other languages subsequently. Luther marries Catherine von Bora in 1525, and in 1529, such was the uptake and interest in Luther's idea that Charles V then decides to try to ban Luther's ideas. And of course, this kickstarts a huge amount of conflict in different states across the Holy Roman Empire. And Charles V is kind of fighting a rearguard battle then to try and re-establish order within the Holy Roman Empire, because many of these smaller states are interested in taking up Martin Luther's concepts and ideas, because they too saw the corruption within the Roman Church. So he dies later on in 1546 of a heart attack. He had 6 children and married Catherine von Bora, as I said, who was actually a former nun. And again, the idea of marrying went against, officially went against the Christian Church's teachings up to this time. So what do we get from Martin Luther's life? Well, one of the first things he did was he inspired a number of second generation reformers. Here's a great wall monument of all the reformers, Calvin's in there, John Knox and others. And they will actually take up the mantle from Luther, inspired by Luther, and they will try to, reform the church, but at a more local level. And this is what leads to a kind of development of national churches throughout Europe rather than one European church. In 1536, Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which dictated very clearly and very rigidly what one had to do and one had to believe and how one had to act in order to find Christian salvation. In 1538, because of his teachings and his writing, he was forced out of Geneva. Just like Martin Luther, sola scriptura, the old Latin phrase meaning only from the scriptures will you find salvation. He also put forward the idea of predestination, that people were predestined from the moment, even before they were born, to go to heaven or hell. So this created a new kind of elitist idea, an almost competitive idea within Christians, that the more pious and the more obedient and the more rigidly they carried out their faith, the better the chance they would have of reaching heaven. He even put a number on it. 144,000 were only meant to make it to heaven. Where he got that number, God only knows, pardon the pun. But it was a very select few in the entire history of the human race that were meant to find salvation in heaven under this concept of predestination. So, in 1555 to 1560, you'll notice this year is important for a very important reason I'll mention later on. Calvin was elected as the absolute spiritual and legal leader of Geneva. Now, there is a great deal of written work about the city of God as it became known under Calvin's leadership, where even dancing was considered to be heresy. Music was considered unchristian. And these new iterations of Protestantism, or in this case, what became known as Calvinism, after Calvin himself, became so severe, so pious, and austere, as in meaning very bare, very rigid, and very severe. Even public displays of affection or laughter, certainly dancing and music, were considered, contrary to the Calvinist faith. So it was an extreme version of Protestantism, and it was, focused on the idea of people being extremely pious. So you can see how Martin Luther, who had initially focused on, financial and moral corruption within the church, has inspired a second generation that is even more severe in their interpretation of Scripture. Now, what is interesting here is if we move over to this side, we have the church response, what became known as the Counter-Reformation. So, a papal bull issued in 1540, recognizing their organization. The organization in question here was the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits were founded to improve the education of priests and to make sure that the next generation and all other generations of priests that were being ordained would be highly educated, the best of the best. And even to this day, the Jesuits are largely considered as having the highest standard of Catholic education. Jesuit schools throughout the world tend to have very good reputations academically. So this is founded by Ignatius Loyola. And between 1545 and 1563, 18 years, the Council of Trent went on. Now, the Council of Trent was convened by Pope Paul the Third, and these 3 sessions of the Council of Trent discussed everything. They discussed Luther's ideas. Were they wrong or they right? For the most part, they condemned them as heresy. But they did look at minor alterations and improvements, one of which, of course, was the Jesuits, to improve the education and standard of priests, but also to underline and reinforce their own beliefs in how they interpreted the Christian faith. So, with this evolution of the first, the pioneer, Martin Luther, and then the second generation, Calvin, and one of his students, John Knox, returned to Scotland, where John Knox founded the Presbyterian Church. But you had many different Reformed churches throughout Europe. You had, for example, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Anglican Church. In France, the Huguenots were the Reformists, or the new Protestants, as you might call them in France. In modern-day Poland, particularly in Scandinavia, became almost entirely Lutheran. So the Calvinists tended to be central mainland Europe, and in Scotland, the Anglican Church was England and Wales, and the Lutheran Church originally was modern-day Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, while all of southern Europe, southern continental Europe, and Ireland remained very Catholic. So the City of God became a central hub from which Calvin's missionaries spread out and brought reformist Christianity to many parts of Europe, and many new national incarnations of Protestantism, as I just mentioned there, emerged in different countries throughout Europe. Now, the church response here is quite important. So we're going to zoom in here a second and have a look at this. So they decreed, the Council of Trent, after 18 years, that faith and good works were required for salvation. They doubled down on their original idea and, totally threw out Martin Luther's justification by faith alone. So they still allowed sale of indulgences, but restricted them in moderation. And Martin Luther's publication, the 95 Theses, was entirely banned. The Jesuits set up to spread Catholicism through education. The Inquisition was created, a trial for religious heresy for beliefs that are anti-Catholic. Now, I'll just jump down here to the Inquisition, because the Inquisition becomes the most feared part of the Church's response. So it was under the control of the Spanish monarchy. It didn't just happen in Spain, but in Spain it was highly organized and very vicious. Tried heretics for non-conformity to Catholic scripture. You even had situations where neighbours informed on neighbours, and they would be duly arrested and tried for heresy and punished. Issued declarations for Jews and Muslims to convert or leave Spain. Those arrested would be interrogated for long periods, and that's why it became known as the Inquisition, because it wasn't just inquiring about your beliefs or your knowledge or opinions, they're literally inquiring about your pain threshold. Often based on one of thousands of informants employed by the Inquisition to inform on other people. It wasn't even quasi-legal, it was inquisition by rumour and accusation. Anyone could be accused of heresy, even those who simply express doubts about the Catholic scripture. The idea that if you expressed any doubts about even the way the church was run, or any interpretation of any part of the Bible, you would be duly arrested and interrogated. Defendants were often severely tortured as punishment for heresy. And they had a whole team of investigators, a Grand Inquisitor, 2 subordinate inquisitors, a scribe to write everything down, and a doctor, obviously, to help with the whole idea of pain management, or to see how far they could push those that they were torturing. And the 2 methods were the strapado and the rack. So, let's go back to why Luther. There are 3 main reasons why he succeeded in taking on the church so successfully. Number 1 was Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Frederick the Wise was his employer, but was also a great patron of other Renaissance artists like Dürer, the wood engraver, the famous engraver, and he was very proud of what Martin Luther was doing. He essentially put the University of Wittenberg on the map. And he hid him in Wartburg Castle after the Diet of Worms. So in doing that, he protected him, and he also gave him the chance to translate the Bible and therefore give German-speaking people a chance to read and interpret Scripture themselves. So his protection and support was absolutely vital to Martin Luther's survival, number one, and the flourishing of his new religion. And Martin Luther, in his own private correspondence, was highly appreciative of his help. The second reason was the printing press. Imagine trying to copy the 95 Theses by hand, scribing it one by one. It would take years upon years. But with the invention of Gutenberg's printing press, it allowed the 95 Theses, which was only a certain number of pages long, to be printed and reprinted and spread throughout the land and right throughout Europe. And that really helped to spread the idea of the ideas that Martin Luther was putting forward. The final reason is more personal to Luther himself. He was a gifted and engaging public speaker. Again, going back to this education in law, he knew how to argue a case. He knew how to interpret certain clauses and regulations, or even the true meaning of, shall we say, in Scripture. It can often be very abstract interpretations, abstract writing. He knew to interpret it, how to interpret it at a very human level. So his background in law is very important. His passion convinced many of the authenticity of his knowledge and his beliefs. He knew what he was talking about. He was educated in theology, highly educated, but also in law. So he had both the manner, the skills, and the knowledge and the passion to actually argue against the church and its corruption. So his main beliefs as well, important to know these. The Bible is the only source of all teachings. Forget about good works under Lutheranism or Protestantism. And following on from that, only faith got you into heaven. So here, the Bible is the source of all teachings. The Catholic Church always held on to the belief that the Pope is also the source of some of the teachings. That's repudiated by Luther. Only the Bible is the source of all teachings, and only faith got you into heaven, justification by faith alone. The Church is controlled by the Prince. It's not a European-wide transnational thing. The Church is controlled by the Prince only. In each state, communion services are said in German, or later on, whatever country it is, the local vernacular language. Only two sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. All Protestants are equal and should be able to read the Bible, and priests are allowed to marry. So a very liberal, very forward-thinking interpretation of Christianity right there. So an end to the idea of the Pope's authority with regard to spiritual teaching. Only faith gets you into heaven. It's a national church controlled by the prince or the monarch. Everything should be said in the local language. Only two sacraments, not seven, only two. All Protestants are considered absolutely equal, and they should be allowed to marry and have children. So, what were the big outcomes? Huge amount of religious conflict throughout Europe between different groups up until the Peace of Augsburg 1555. And the Peace of Augsburg 1555 was the final settlement in Europe. And basically what it said was that the ruler of a state, whatever state or kingdom it might be, only that ruler got to decide what faith that state was going to be, whether it was going to be Protestant, Lutheran, Calvinist, or Catholic as it originally was. So that Peace of Augsburg cemented the fragmentation of beliefs throughout Europe, as we can see here in this map here of the European continent. So the national churches begin to emerge then, and there's a complete breakup and hodgepodge of different religions in different states. For example, England, Wales is now Anglican. Scotland becomes hugely Presbyterian. Ireland remains Catholic apart from the Anglo-Irish sections, particularly around the northeast of Ireland, for example. So that's basically covering the entire Reformation. The conflict and everything that it brought about was all essentially brought to an end with this agreement in 1555. So let's move on to our revision quiz. Which of the following answers best describes the corruption within the pre-Reformation Roman Church? You can stop your video now and I'll give the answer in a few moments. So the answer is the third one: nepotism, pluralism, and particularly sale of indulgences. Question 2. Martin Luther fundamentally disagreed with the Roman Church on the point of salvation. His belief was summed up in the phrase, stop your video, and the answer is justification by faith alone. Question 3. Who was Pope at the time of the Reformation? Stop your video, and the answer is Pope Leo X. Pope Leo X, an interesting little side fact about him is that he was related to one of the patrons of northern Italy. You can imagine maybe how he bought his way in there. Question 4. Martin Luther nailed his list of objections and criticisms of the Roman Church to a church door in Wittenberg on the 31st of October 1517. This list of criticisms was called, stop your video, and the answer is the 95 Theses. Question 5. Martin Luther was called to a meeting of church leaders in Worms on the 18th of April 1521 to answer for his criticisms of the church. This formal hearing was called, stop your video, and the answer is the Diet of Worms. Question 6. Who secretly provided refuge and sanctuary for Martin Luther in 1521? Stop your video. This is a picture of him. The answer is Frederick the Wise. Question 7. During 1521, Luther began to translate the Bible into German. Soon after, the Bible was being translated into many European languages. These languages were known at the time as, stop your video, and the answer is vernacular languages. Question 8. In Luther's revised version of Protestant Christianity, only 2 sacraments were considered valid. Which 2? Stop your video. And the answer is baptism and Eucharist. Question 9. Luther's Protestant Revolution inspired others to interpret Scripture differently and found their own churches. Name the Reformation theologian or leader pictured below. And the answer is John Calvin. And finally, question 10. In Luther's belief, what is the source of all Christian teaching and Christian authority? Stop your video. And the answer is the Bible. Of course, the Catholic Church held on to the fact that both the Pope and the Bible were authorities on Christian teaching, but Luther's belief and all reformist churches believe that only the Bible is the source of all Christian teaching and authority. So that's all for this video on the Reformation. Once again, thank you for watching this Grade Academy lecture on junior cycle history, and until next time, happy learning.